Now, right now we've been following an upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant here in the city of Boulder. Boulder spent $50 million to upgrade the wastewater treatment plant. Why did they do that? Because the EPA said, you're putting too much ammonia in the water, into the creek. They were not meeting the ammonia requirements, so they had to upgrade. Had nothing to do with the estrogenic chemicals in the wastewater. So they went from what we call a trickling filter system to an activated sludge system. And the important take-home message is that this is a lot more efficient. Takes longer, but it does a much more efficient job of processing the wastewater or the sewage. If we look at the total estrogenicity in the effluent in 2005 and 2006. Now, it dropped in 2006, and that's because we started to get a reduction in the use of, particularly at the commercial level, of the detergents that contain the nonylphenols. Our nonylphenol levels just about disappeared practically in that time, and our estrogenicity dropped in half. But then we had, in 2007, we had the upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant, and look what it did to the estrogen levels in the water. We have a paper in press right now that describes this. If we look at nuptial tubercles, for example, here's 2005. We're still getting a pretty significant effect in 2006. In 2008, no effect after 28 days of exposure. Doesn't mean there isn't any effect after 56 days, or if you lived in this, because these guys, when they're in the river, of course, they're constantly swimming in this stuff. But it does say that a slight improvement, only a $50 million upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant, certainly decreased the activity. Looked at vitellogenin, look what happened to it. You really you couldn't see this on this graph if we stayed with the actual scale. Wouldn't even be there, but we put it there just to say that there was something measurable, but almost nothing compared to what we were getting before. So the upgrade really had a tremendous effect. If I can use the iceberg analogy, however, I want to point out that estrogenic endocrine disrupting chemicals are only one component of what's in the wastewater effluent that's affecting wildlife, or at least its potential. And remember, down here, the rest of that iceberg is everything else that's out there that we don't even know what many of these chemicals are capable of doing. What else do we find in wastewater? Well, we can measure anti-androgens, of course, anti-thyroid compounds. Some of these, notice genistein shows up in more than one category. Glucocorticoids, which are the natural hormones produced by your adrenal that are involved in stress. Pharmaceuticals like ibuprofen, caffeine, that's not a pharmaceutical, just caffeine. Prozac, Lipitor, all kinds of pesticides, flame retardants, these so-called PDBEs, which are in all your clothing, all of your furniture. If you fly a lot, you'll have high levels of PBDEs in your urine because you're on airplanes and everything is coated with these flame retardants for very obvious reasons on airplanes. Parabens, which are some of the compounds that are found in cosmetics, so are phthalates and a bunch of other things. Some of the sunscreen ingredients, all this stuff is in that wastewater effluent that's coming back into the rivers. And if you go downstream, by the time you get down to New Orleans, you can measure estradiol in the tap water. You can measure Prozac in the tap water. Of course, everybody is always having a good time in New Orleans. Maybe there's a correlation there, I don't know, but nevertheless. So the list goes on. In fact, if you have an analytical procedure that is sensitive enough to measure something, I can guarantee you you're going to find it in wastewater because it passed through us on the way to get there. So we've got these fish out here living in a sea of chemicals. Since they were cleaning up a little bit the estrogens, we were looking at some other compounds that we were interested in too. And we were interested in some of the neuroactive compounds. This one's an anti-epileptic. The rest of these fall under the general category of antidepressants. And I'll just mention two of them. Fluoxetine, which is the active ingredient of Prozac and roughly 13 other compounds or 13 other preparations that are out there that you can purchase, and sertraline or Zoloft. These are very important antidepressants. They have slightly different mechanisms of action on the brain. And we measured the concentrations of these not only in the wastewater effluent, but we, as I showed on the previous slide, but they're also present in the brains of these fish. We actually analyzed the brains of these fish. If we looked upstream fish, we couldn't find it. If we looked downstream, we found significant amounts of, just showing you data for sertraline here. Again, in the water upstream we couldn't find it. In the water downstream there was quite a bit of it. This is just for this one particular thing. Now, whenever I show data like this, people say, well, that's Boulder for you. Okay, but we ran a parallel study in Des Moines, Iowa, and guess what? Their fish brains have Prozac in them too. It's not just Boulder, okay? You can't stereotype Boulder with respect to what we find in the wastewater effluents and find in our fish downstream. In fact, they got more. That's probably not significant, but they got more. And it looks like there's more in the water too. And it's not that much difference in size of town. So that's kind of interesting. So what does that mean for fish? Well, it may be that, you know, we got a bunch of happy suckers down there. Okay. But we ran some laboratory experiments to see what the heck was going on in these fish. And we went, again, since in the laboratory, we looked at fathead minnows. Here's our male with his nuptial tubercles. But we actually exposed them to environmentally relevant concentrations of fluoxetine and sertraline while they were developing, from eggs to hatching. And then we tested their reflexes after they'd hatched. And what did we find? Oh, their escape behavior was slowed down. Now that's pretty critical for a fish, particularly a young fish that's just hatched. That means it can't avoid predators as readily. There's some giant neurons in the fish brain that control this reflex that they have, that if you approach from one side, their body instantly curves very, very fast. And that reaction was slowed down significantly by previous exposure during development to these drugs. So be interesting to see what happens. There's a lot of other neuroactive things out there. You only have to watch television to realize that this stuff's in the wastewater effluent too. These are so-called GABA receptor agonists. They're called the Z drugs. You might recognize them: Lunestra, Ambien, Valium. These are the ones that help you sleep. They're going into our wastewater treatment plants. We don't know anything about them yet. Tip of the iceberg is the fish. What about all the other vertebrates? The ones that are eating those fish, that are accumulating some of these. Interestingly enough, we found the fish were accumulating ethinyl estradiol, the birth control estrogen. They weren't accumulating natural estrogens or any of the other synthetic estrogens, but they were retaining that particular one. And we're not sure what that means yet. And of course, there's old number one down here. What does it mean for us, too? So it's interesting that up till now, at least, nobody regulates chemicals at these trace concentrations, part per billion or part per trillion. There are no regulations. Whoops. Remember, fish endocrine system works just like ours. Okay? Okay, let's talk about drinking water for a little bit. A lot of chemicals out there, we're in the middle of it. Okay? But the obvious question is our drinking water safe? I'm going to give you an academic answer. The answer is yes. And the answer is no. And so I'll show you a couple of reasons why it's yes, and I'll show you a couple of reasons why it's no. First of all of these chemicals are passing through our bodies. And in some cases, we're dumping them down the drain as well, which is something you should never do with pharmaceuticals. No matter what anybody tells you, do not dump them down the drain. They are not outdated. Outdated pharmaceuticals are a ploy to sell more pharmaceuticals, period. These things don't degrade when they're dry. There are a few pharmaceuticals that are light sensitive. There are a few that will degrade with time. But if you keep them dry, bacteria can't work on them. Fungi can't work on them. I've got some chemicals that are on my shelf that have been there for 40 years, and they're just as potent today as they were 40 years ago, particularly if I dumped them into the Boulder water supply, which I don't plan to do. So all these chemicals pass through us. They end up at the wastewater treatment plant. I haven't addressed this at all. The bulk of them end up in what we now call biosolids. You may have heard the term sludge in the old days. That didn't sound good, so they changed it to biosolids. Sounds much better, much cleaner. So the biosolids are either dumped in landfills, about half of it, and the other half goes out on agricultural fields as fertilizer. And the effluent, of course, goes into the river, and that's where the fish run into it. And, of course, it's now river water, so that becomes one of the components that's coming back through us, is from treatment of river water downstream. And, of course, the further downstream you go, the greater accumulation of this stuff happens, because we're dumping it in at a constant rate. And all of these chemicals have natural half-lives, as we call them, once they're in the river. A half-life is how many days does it take before half of it has disappeared in some way. Now, it may have gone into the sediments. It may have actually been degraded. Depends on the compound. And so how long does it take it to get to half the concentration? For a lot of these chemicals, it's a lot longer than the rate at which we're dumping them in, and that's why in recent years we're starting to see these effects, where we didn't see them 50 years ago, or even 40 years ago. And of course, we eat this stuff, and some of this stuff comes back in our food, along with some of the pesticides and some of the other things. Now, I was taken by these headlines, because my first thought was, when I saw these articles come out in the last, 2 or 3 weeks, what are guys taking birth control pills for? But this is a classic example of a nonsense correlation. Yes, over the last 70 years, the use of birth control pills has increased tremendously. But so have all of those other estrogenic chemicals. So the correlation is not with just the birth control pill. That's not the problem. I think the Catholic Church was behind this again, but I won't go into that. That's a political statement. But what's happened is that now I don't know where I was going with that. That's what I get for digressing for a moment. Kills you every time. So the correlation is with all these chemicals, not with just this one thing, the birth control pill. It's the total exposure that we're getting to estrogenic chemicals. It's not any one single chemical. We can't point the finger at one of these chemicals because it's a mixture of chemicals that we're being affected by. Oops. Go back. Just gave away the answer. How much water would you have to drink if you were down in New Orleans, okay, to equal the amount of estrogen an adult male is already excreting every day? And I was going to have you guess, but I won't bother since my rapid finger already showed that. You have to drink 400 gallons a day, okay? In other words, the level of estrogen that's already in your body naturally, even if you're a male, you'd have to drink 400 gallons a day. That'll change your lifestyle, believe me. So what's the big deal about these chemicals that are getting into the drinking water? The big deal is, if that's the only source of estrogenic chemicals in your life, no problem. On the other hand, if you add it to all of these other sources of estrogenic chemicals, is it possible that that might be just the amount to push you over the edge to get an effect? In which case, that would be a bad thing. Again, pretty small amount. Okay. That's to the standard laboratory adult human. Now, we're talking about recycling our wastewater effluents. Here in the West, we're looking at droughts. We're expecting more of this with the global warming that's not happening. That's a whole other issue. So, cities are saying, why can't we just recycle our wastewater effluent back through the city one more time before we put it back in the river? We're still going to put it all back. And if we phase it in, you know, won't affect the stream flow. We can do this. What about what's in the water? Okay. Somebody got onto this real quick and said, toilet to tap, that sounds like a really great idea. That's going to sell a lot of stuff, okay? And in fact, of course, the artist got into this real quickly too, as you might well guess. And essentially, what we're concerned about is, since water treatment facilities are not designed to remove chemicals at these parts per billion, parts per trillion levels, then what's going to happen when we start recycling this stuff together? I was consulting with a city in California, I won't mention the name, and I asked them, well, what about they were thinking of doing this, and they were concerned about the estrogenic chemicals, so that's why we were talking with them. And I said, by the way, what about perchlorate? Perchlorate's an antithyroid compound, and it's well known that it's in rather high concentrations, above what EPA used to say was acceptable. They're not saying it at the moment. It's under advisement. It's like 14 parts per million in the drinking water in some of the Southern California cities. And that's because this stuff accumulates in the Colorado River as it's going there, and it goes through a lot of military bases and so forth. So they said, well, we don't have a perchlorate problem in our city. And I said, why? Really? Why is that? And he says, the people don't know about perchlorate here. Now, we haven't addressed things like lead, bacteria, and perchlorate. At least the first two are good reasons to filter your water, and there are special kinds of filters that are pretty good at removing things like lead and bacteria. Bacteria tend to make you sick. Sometimes you get a big flood of it coming out of your tap in your kitchen, might be a problem. There's some articles over here if you're interested about the kinds of filters they recommend for these kinds of things. So, and lead's a real problem. You may have all copper pipes. There may be no lead in the water coming from your wastewater or from your drinking water treatment plant, but when it runs through your house, you've got bad soldering someplace in the house that's all lead based. You may have, it may only be one tap in your house. You might have significant lead, the others you may not have any lead. But they recommend probably, at least your drinking water, you might want to have a filter that might take out things like lead and so forth. Perchlorate, the bad thing about perchlorate is there's no way to get it out other than possibly reverse osmosis. Really hard to get it out. None of the standard treatments that we can use to take out all this other stuff works for perchlorate. It's a very small molecule. This is the perchlorate. It's just oxygen and chloride and a hydrogen thrown in. It's produced by all kinds of explosive kinds of things like fireworks and rocket and jet fuels and our good old infernal combustion engine. It's often associated with military bases, for example, in terms of contamination. It contaminates drinking water, inhibits thyroid secretion, which is a real problem. Special concerns that we have for it is during pregnancy, in that the thyroid hormone is essential for normal development of the nervous system. And if we impair the ability to produce thyroid hormones during pregnancy, then the nervous system doesn't develop properly, and you can't fix it later because it's one of those things that happens during development, and we get permanent mental retardation as a result. Also, since there's a lot of development of the nervous system that's still taking place during childhood, for children it's a problem as well. May not be a problem for adults, but it does affect mental development. And in fact, thyroid deficiencies around the world is the leading cause of mental retardation in the world today, primarily due to low iodine in diets, because iodine goes into the production of thyroid hormones. Here's a map of the US showing where the major perchlorate spills have occurred over time. Notice the Rio Grande drainage. They have high perchlorate down there. Notice Southern California, the Colorado River Aqueduct, all this water coming to Southern California, they have high perchlorate in their water as a result. We have only one contamination in Colorado. You can guess where that is. It's between Pueblo and Colorado Springs. That's the military base there. That's our only contamination. That's not too much a concern. It's going in the Arkansas River. It goes on out to the Mississippi, and they get it down in New Orleans. Another important aspect of our water supplies is the gas and oil industry and the development that's going on, particularly on the western slope, but it's also out here on the eastern slope as well, particularly as you get down near Walsenburg, where they're having real problems with people's wells. And it's a problem that relates to pumping mixtures of toxic chemical solutions into the ground to release the gas. And then they pump the gas out. Well, actually, the gas is under pressure, so it comes out pretty much on itself. They then remove the rest of the toxic materials that come out with it, but it leaves a lot of those toxic materials down in the ground. Now, fracking, when it was originally developed back around 1900, used water. But guess what? Water's too expensive. So the oil and gas companies started using their waste chemicals, mixtures of chemicals, some of which are endocrine disrupting chemicals, many of which they don't even know for sure what they're dumping down there. So essentially what they do is they pump this down into the ground, and they get these zones of hydrofracking, which then releases the gas, but also then releases toxics and methane, and it gets into the aquifers, the underground water, and this contaminates people's wells. If you look at the June issue of High Country News, there's a wonderful, well, there's an awful article, very well done article, let's put it this way, about this gentleman's ranch up in Wyoming and what's happened to his water supply as a result of gas and oil development in Wyoming, and he's not isolated. The title of the article is Hydrofracked, question mark. And Theo Colburn here in Colorado, over in Paonia, runs what's called the Endocrine Disruption Exchange. Her focus the last several years has been on the oil and gas development on the western slope in terms of its effects on air pollution, water pollution, and others. If you go to their website, and it's on your handout sheet as well that you picked up when you came, and you go to that website, it's the TEDx website, you click on natural gas, and you'll get be able to watch this video, which says what you need to know about natural gas production, and it's a rather well done discussion of what's going on. Theo's really good at not taking sides when she does these sort of things. She lets you make up your own mind as to what the problems are. And so she has a pretty good rapport even with at least some of the industry people. Another side effect of fracking that we know about, they're seeing this in Ohio right now, and that is you get earthquakes. Amazingly enough, here are all these fracking sites, and they have an earthquake epicenter right in the neighborhood. And this is happening over and over again. Some of you are old enough possibly to remember when Rocky Mountain Arsenal had a deep well that they were disposing of toxic chemicals into, and it was causing earthquakes in the Denver area. So they stopped doing that, and guess what? Haven't had an earthquake since in the Denver area as a result of not putting this water. Yeah, but again, it's only a correlation. No cause effect. I want to switch gears a little bit and tell you about, very quickly, about some laboratory studies that have been done on endocrine disrupting chemicals. Since with humans, all we have are correlations for the most part. Okay. So, twin studies. People like twin studies because they have built-in controls. They're really kind of nice. Okay. And there have been twin studies done in mice and cattle that I'm just going to briefly mention. Think about the tiny amounts of hormones that are being produced by an embryo, particularly a mouse embryo. Okay, the mouse embryo is only about yay big, maybe even smaller, and it's producing hormones at very, 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 very low concentrations. Okay, and they're very important for the development of those critters. Oh, so if we look in the uterus of a mouse, what we see is there's a, I use the word twin, okay, this is a litter, all right, but humans used to have twins too, but now they tend to have litters. Here's a female developing between two males. Now there'll be another female that may have a male on one side and a female on the other side. There'll be other females that will develop between two females. It's all kind of random chance. But if you look at the individuals in terms of where they developed in utero, and look at them as neonates or as adults, you see some really interesting correlations. Correlations. Okay? This is what we'd call a 2M female. She developed between two males. If we look at her anatomy, her physiology, and her behavior, we find that she will be more like a male in whatever characters we measure than like a female who was a one male female or a zero male female. What about the males? Same thing happens in mice. A male developing between two females tends to be slightly feminized with respect to his anatomy, his physiology, and his behavior, both as a neonate and as an adult. Tiny amounts of hormones. This is without any endocrine disruptors around. Okay? That's a really sensitive system. A really sensitive system. How about cattle? Big hunking animal. Sometimes have twins. Not real common in cattle. They usually have one, but they can have two. And if they have two and they're the same sex, they're both normal. But if one is a male and the other is a female, the male is always perfectly normal. The female is always an intersex. What's called a free martin. If you look up free martin on the internet, you can find out. We've known about this for hundreds of years. Really a neat thing. Not for the farmer or the rancher, because this is a pretty much worthless animal for him because you can't breed it. You recognize that? Nebraska, as we say it here in Colorado. What do you suppose all those little green dots are? Feedlots. Feedlots. A lot of feedlots. Most of those cattle are steers. And of course, they've been castrated, so they don't have a normal source of androgens. And that's what makes muscle, right? So it makes guys have more muscle visibly at least, than females. It's due to androgens. So steers don't have any androgens, so in order to get them to put on weight, we give them androgens. So roughly 80 to 90% of the cattle in these feedlots are being treated with trenbolone, a synthetic androgen. Those dots represent 4.5 million beef cattle per year going through those feedlots in Nebraska. And they are producing, well, most of them are treated with trenbolone. Some of them are also treated with estrogens as well. And it's not that you can't treat them with estrogens. You have to keep the estrogen level below a certain level, or the FDA won't let you sell your beef. They produce 32 million pounds of urine and feces per day. Where does that go? They don't have a wastewater treatment plant. It goes right into the rivers. And guess what? We find masculinized females downstream from their waste. Just the opposite of what we see here in Colorado from the estrogens. Now, if we look at human twins, there have been 4 studies published in very recent years. And they show in every case where one of the twins is a male and the other is a female, the female is somewhat masculinized by having spent time in the same uterus during early development. That says the human fetus is pretty sensitive. The things they measured, I won't go into much detail, but risk-taking behavior. Okay, they drove as badly as men, apparently. Brain development. You know how studies have been done that show that to solve the same problem, a man uses different parts of his brain than a woman does to get the same solution to a problem. And we can measure that with, because we can measure electrical activity now in the brain, and we can get a pretty good picture of this part of the brain lights up when the guy does it, and this part of the brain lights up when a woman does it. And they found that to some extent these twin women who spent life with a male in utero tend to solve these problems like a male does rather than like a female does. They also showed that these women tended to be more aggressive by whatever, this was another, each of these is a separate study, so they each picked something different to look at. And the last one was hearing. The male hearing apparatus anatomically is different from the female hearing apparatus, believe it or not. And in these females, there was some anatomical changing so that they had more male-like hearing apparatuses. So apparently when their partner said, "Would you take out the garbage?" they didn't hear it either. They also looked at reproductive success and noticed that it was reduced in these females compared to female-female twins. And they also had evidence that there might be an increased chance of breast cancer in these females, but I'm not really excited about the numbers that they had for that. We do know that pregnant moms that have higher than normal phthalate levels, I thought this was an unusual terminology but in this publication. There's nothing normal about phthalate levels. You're not supposed to have phthalates in your blood. But if I were to take a blood sample from everybody in this room, let's see, 40 people, there's 2 of you probably would not have phthalates in your urine, or might not, by chance, because 95% of us do have phthalates in our urine. But these are moms who had higher phthalates than other moms in the hospitals, and what they've discovered was that there were more frequent reproductive abnormalities in newborn males of the mothers that had higher phthalate levels. Another study looked at bisphenol A and saw similar effects of that particular chemical. Correlations again, correlations. So how about some laboratory studies on endocrine disrupting chemicals? I already said that. No, we're now looking at effects on humans, particularly the fetus. And what we know about the fish is nothing like what may be going on with fetuses, because they are much, much more sensitive. And in fact, a good friend of mine who recently passed away, Howard Byrne, member of the National Academy of Science and one of the endocrinologists who first started looking at the problems of endocrine disruption long before we even coined the term of endocrine disruption, described the fetus as being a very fragile creature. In fact, he published a paper called The Fragile, can't say that, The Fragile Fetus. And it turns out that the fetus is very, very, very sensitive and very prone to endocrine disrupting effects. And why is that? It's because the fetus has no defenses, no natural defenses against exogenous chemicals. The fetal liver doesn't do the things an adult liver can do. It hasn't progressed to that. It relies entirely on mom to do this. So if mom gets a load of chemicals that she can't deal with, she passes them on to Junior. And Junior just sits there and recycles them because he can't do anything about them. It's illustrated in this cartoon. Here's mom's blood. Whatever's in mom's blood goes into Junior's blood. Once it gets in Junior's blood, it gets distributed to all the tissues in his body. It also ends up in amniotic fluid, which he then re-ingests either through his lungs or through his digestive system, or absorbs it directly through his skin, and it all gets right back into him. And he has no way to get rid of it once he is affected by it. And we know that they're extremely sensitive to things like estrogens, as we've seen from some of the other animal studies. If we look at pregnant women in general, here's 54 pregnant women who were analyzed, who had their urine analyzed for chemicals. Here's the phthalates, polychlorinated aryl hydrocarbons, which includes PCBs, flame retardants, pesticides, and notice that some of these have a little dark knob up here. Represents one chemical called cotinine. 35 of these 54 women were smoking while they were pregnant. And it shows up in their urine. There's a measurement called the anogenital distance. And it's the distance between the anus and the genital openings. And this is true for all mammals, mice and humans, that distance is shorter in females than it is in males at birth. And it's one of the ways we can easily tell whether a newborn mouse is a male or a female. We can also tell whether a newborn human is a male or a female by that same observation. Usually there's some other things that we can use too, but we do have situations of what we call ambiguous sex at birth, where we can't tell a parent yet whether that child is a male or a female. So if we look at offspring who had prenatal phthalate exposure, we see that there's a reduced anogenital distance, and we also see reduced testicular function in those individuals when they get older. Now, we've seen this in rats, and we've also seen it in humans. In rats, it's cause-effect. In humans, it's correlation, because we can't do cause-effect studies for very good reasons. We also have similar data for bisphenol A for both rats and humans. Feminizing effects of those embryos, very, very low concentrations of these chemicals during development. Going back to this figure, we said that it depends on the total amount of stuff, not necessarily what's in your tap water. But what's in the tap water might be enough to affect Junior, because he's so much more sensitive to these chemicals than anybody else is. The last thing I want to briefly show you has to do with some studies in mice that are called epigenetic effects. And by that, we mean the area that we call epigenetics means that there's a heritable change in how our genes are expressed. You're familiar with mutations where genes are changed. This is not a mutation. The genes are not changed. It changes the pattern, maybe the sequence in which genes are activated, or which genes are activated, or when they are activated, or when they're not activated. So it's really a change in the pattern of how the genes are expressed, either in development or later in life. And this is called, this area of study is known as epigenetics. And it can happen within an individual organism within lifetime. This is how a single cell that we start out with can differentiate into all kinds of different cell types. And all of those cell types then reproduce their same cell types because they have different patterns of genes that are turned on than in other cells in our body. All our cells have exactly the same genes, but they're turned on and off differently in different patterns in different parts of the body. That happens during development. And then decides which genes are going to be on and which are going to be off in what cells. We're now looking at it in terms of what is being called fetal or developmental basis of adult disease. The changes that take place in these patterns of activation that occur in the embryos or in the fetuses show up later in adults. Let me give you an example of typical studies in laboratory rodents. These are mice. Okay, this is a female female mouse. She's pregnant, and during the period when sex determination is taking place, we know when that is. We expose that mouse to a chemical, and then we take the chemical away. Here's the 3 chemicals that have been tested. Methoxychlor is the pesticide, it's estrogenic, that we replace DDT with. Vinclozolin is a fungicide that is an anti-androgen. And diethylstilbestrol is a synthetic estrogen, very powerful synthetic estrogen. I'll say more about that one in a little bit. So, I'll just talk about vinclozolin. And the effects are going to be a little bit different than they would be if we used one of the estrogens, but we're going to use an anti-androgen in this case. So we expose the mice, then we look at the offspring. And if we take the female offspring and we mate her with a male who's never been exposed to vinclozolin, and we look at their offspring, they're all perfectly normal. But if we look at that male who was exposed during development to an anti-androgen, and we mate him with a female, well, first of all, we look at him, he's not normal. He has reduced fertility, but he can be bred. And when he gets older, he shows increased prostate and testicular cancer, particularly, and some others. Now, if we mate him to a female who's never been exposed to vinclozolin, and we look at the offspring, all of the females are perfectly normal. All the males show reduced fertility and increased cancer rates when they get older. So if we take that male and breed him to a female who's never been exposed to vinclozolin, and we look at the offspring of that generation, guess what? All the females are perfectly normal. All the males show reduced fertility and increased cancer. Guess what happens in the next generation? Same thing. Okay? This pattern of gene activation is being changed by an exposure during fetal life, and that change is permanent, and it gets transmitted to all of the offspring. If we followed methoxychloroquine and diethylstilbestrol through, we'd have to look at the female to see most of the effects of that exposure. But there'll be some in the males too. Now, what about us? Okay, well, guess what? We now have an experiment that was done on humans. We call it the DES experiment. Okay? Diethylstilbestrol is an extremely potent estrogen. It was given between 1950 and 1970 to women who had a chance of miscarriage, because one of the problems is low estrogen. If you have low estrogen, you will tend to have uterine breakdown and sloughing off of this little developing parasite that we call the fetus. So we get a miscarriage. Usually most miscarriages happen between the second and third month of pregnancy, and that's when the corpus luteum and the placenta are trading over functions. And if that trade over doesn't work very well, we tend to get a miscarriage. But it can happen at any time if estrogen levels drop. So it was thought, well, if this works for women at risk, well, why not give it to all women? Or lots of them. And so we treated lots of women with diethylstilbestrol while they were pregnant to make sure they didn't miscarriage, even if they didn't have a history of miscarriage. Just seemed like a good idea. So, as I just said, if we look at those moms, however, we discovered that they showed increased vaginal, ovarian, and breast cancers. And not only that, the vaginal cancer was a very unique form of vaginal cancer that's very rare in the human population, but very common in these women. If we looked at the DES sons and daughters, when they got to the age where they were likely to start showing increased cancers, i.e. beyond 40, we saw increased reproductive cancers. There are some studies that claim at least that there's an increase in homosexuality and an increased incidence of transsexuals among the offspring of these DES-treated women. There's even a website that you can find about transsexuals of mothers who were exposed to DES. They've got their own website out there. Scientifically, we're not real sure about these two, but there's no doubt about this one. Now, the sons and daughters had children, and their children are just now entering that age group where we're likely to see these kinds of things. And of course the question is, what are we going to see? And the last time I gave this talk, I had to just leave it at that. First paper has now been published on the grandchildren, on at least some of the grandchildren, one cohort of grandchildren, whose grandmothers were treated with diethylstilbestrol. And the answer is yes. We're seeing a higher than expected frequency of these reproductive cancers in these offspring. So it's not just a mouse phenomenon, it may be a human phenomenon as well. The fetus is extremely sensitive to these chemicals. And that maybe should be our focus. We have hundreds of laboratory studies done by competent scientists that tell us the same story. Interestingly enough, if you look at the funding sources of those scientific studies that don't support the endocrine disrupting activity of these chemicals, they're usually supported by the chemical companies themselves. Don't know whether that's just pure chance or what that is, but it's a fact. There have been a couple of papers, in fact, published focusing on if you're funded by the chemical companies, you tend to get these results, and if you're funded by the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health, you tend to get these slightly different results. Don't know. Lots of research. What's the real problem, of course, is one that we all ignore. Got it. Number one is 7 billion people producing domestic waste, trash, agricultural waste, and industrial waste, and dumping it all into the environment. We can take fishes from the bottom of the ocean, deep sea fishes, fishes that never come to the surface, and they're contaminated with some of these chemicals. In the bottom of the ocean. As the ecologists would say, we fouled our nest. And that's one of the first signs of a population going belly up in ecology, is the increase in your pollutants. Now, one of the good sides, maybe all these estrogenic chemicals are going to affect our reproduction and slow down our population growth. However, that's probably not such a good idea because we're taking everybody else with us in the process, all the wildlife. I'm not even going to try to document what we know about wild mammals and wild reptiles and wild birds and wild amphibians with respect to this, but if you want information, I've got it. And you've got my email address on the very first page of your handout. Of course, Al Bartlett's been lecturing out of Boulder, a physicist. What's a physicist doing lecturing to people about population? It's just simple math, that's all. You can't do this. And here we're trying to pump up the world delivery of food. Real big problem. Some of you may remember that there was a big movement back in the 60s called ZPG, Zero Population Growth. There's still a Zero Population Growth Society in Boston. I don't know what they're up to, but they're not very effective because we are a long way from zero population growth. In fact, what have we done? Thanks to modern chemistry, we can take infertile people and cause them to have 8 and 10 kids at once. Just really smart maneuver. This was a movie. I don't know, anybody ever see that movie? I don't think it was very popular. Never heard of the actors either, more than likely. So what do we do about it? Well, you know, males get fixed, Females can take birth control pills. It's no worse in the water than if they're not, about the same amount of estrogen. We know that all other methods seem to have a rather high failure rate for reproduction, especially abstinence. Doesn't seem to work very well. Second thing is interim fixes. And those are things that we can do something about even today, right now. As I said before, it's much easier, less expensive to not put the crap in the water than it is to try to take it out afterwards. So, you need to educate yourself and others. Just eat foods that can rot. Another good rule is if a third grader can't pronounce the ingredients, don't eat it. Reduce your waste, use less non-recycled products. In fact, not only reduce your rates, but increase recycling, because we need to get so we're at 100% at some time. Don't use products known to contain EDCs. How do you find that out? Because they don't have to list them on the ingredients. Why not? Because they're inert. They're only trace chemicals. They don't have to tell you if they're there or not. Some do, but most don't. But I gave you a list of websites that you can start using that do have information about some of those. And that's on that 2-page handout sheet. By the way, if you want an extensive list of information about endocrine disruption, I have an 8-page bibliography where you can document everything that I've said today and more. As I said, don't flush outdated drugs down the drain. They're not. They're still potent. Insist that the government control big business rather than the reverse. Now, what do I mean by that? First of all, natural chemicals aren't regulated. Nobody does those. So things like estradiol won't be regulated because it's a natural chemical. That's why a lot of the stuff you buy in health food stores that are natural ingredients, you have no guarantee of what's in the container, what the concentration is or anything, because the FDA doesn't control any of that stuff. There's no control over the packaging of those or purity or anything on those kinds of compounds because they're natural chemicals. The EPA and the FDA are responsible for protecting us from environmental chemicals, that's the EPA, and drugs, basically, and quality of our food, and that's the FDA. And the jurisdiction gets really fuzzy sometimes, and if there's a question about, is this yours or is it ours, nobody handles it. And so a lot of them just sort of fall in the cracks, and nobody looks at them. The EPA, of course, is controlled by Congress and lobbies. Lobbies apparently have some influence on the Congress too. Who are the ones that are involved in these kinds of chemicals? Gas and oil, chemical companies, cosmetic companies, pharmaceutical companies. Notice I didn't say anything about who regulates cosmetics. Oh yeah, and how many chemicals has EPA banned? We already addressed that. The FDA is also controlled by Congress and by lobbies. And those include the cosmetic companies, the pharmaceutical companies, and the food lobbies. Now, when Congress set up the FDA, they charged them in 1938 with also looking at cosmetics, food, drug, and cosmetics. But the cosmetic companies lobbied like crazy, and so the FDA made a formal statement that says we're really not going to regulate cosmetics. So, who does cosmetics? The FDA says cosmetic products and ingredients are not subject to FDA pre-market approval. So you can put anything you want in a cosmetic. They're not going to look at it. Even though Congress charged them originally to do that, they don't do it. So who does? The Cosmetics Ingredient Review Panel. and they're appointed by the cosmetics companies. So the fox controls the henhouse, so to speak. Oh, there I go again. Not used to being wired. So Procter & Gamble is probably the biggest company. They have 687 products on the market last count. Revlon, Unilever, Estee Lauder, those are the big movers. Where are their lobbies right now? They're all over in Brussels, where the head of the European Union is, lobbying them to stop banning chemicals that they have in their products. For quite a while, they have been making two sets of products, one that they can sell in Europe and one that they don't have to clean up and they can sell it here. That's starting to change, but it's a slow process. Third thing that we need to do is to consider what's called sustainability. There's an underground movement slowly coming up in the country called something I can't pronounce. Sustainability. I've got a couple of books down here. This one is interesting in that the nature of the paper it's printed on is totally recyclable, which is not always the case. But I would recommend, if you don't know anything about sustainability, those are a couple of good places to start. And the idea is that essentially everything is recycled, that we only produce things that we can reuse. I made a calculation with the amount of estradiol, for example, that's going into the wastewater treatment plants. If we recovered that estradiol and sold it at the price that Sigma Chemical now sells the pure chemical for, we've got about $1 million to $10 million worth of estradiol that we're pouring down the drain. And we could reuse that stuff. We're just wasting it. So we've really got to think about more efficient ways to recycle 100% of what we use, not 10%. We've got to start toward recycling, but we've got a long way to go to produce a sustainable society. And that's pretty much the goal. Basically, no waste. We don't waste anything. We use everything. I repeat, no waste is the idea of sustainability. Now, obviously, there's going to be some waste. There's a thing in physics called entropy. You can't get away from that. So you're going to lose something along the way. You're never going to get 100% back, okay? But it's a goal to work toward if we want to continue using this planet in the way that we've been using it in the past. CU has an environmental center. You might look up on their website. Their latest newsletter focused on the idea of sustainability in terms of not just sustainability in terms of using the word sustainability to say that you're doing this sort of thing, but what it really means to get involved with a sustainable society. And with that, I'll just need to acknowledge the fact that the work that we've done it's all responsible for a lot of students here at the university that have worked with us, a variety of my own colleagues that I've worked with from all of these organizations. And we've had lots of funding from a lot of sources, including the City of Boulder, the USGS, the Colorado Department of Health, the Colorado Division of Wildlife, and interestingly enough, the US EPA has also supported our work. So.